History often turns on battles, revolutions, or political gambles. But beneath all of that, beneath every empire's rise and collapse, there's a quieter force at work: debt. Not just personal loans or business obligations, but national IOUs so enormous they determine the fate of entire economies. And here's the part almost nobody realizes: the modern debt system wasn't some natural evolution. It was engineered, designed deliberately across 3 centuries by a handful of financial architects who understood that if you control debt, you control nations. Today, every country on Earth is submerged in obligations. The United States carries a staggering $38 trillion. Japan sits on $9 trillion. Across the globe, the total has surged to $315 trillion, triple the size of the world economy. But this leads to a question so basic, it's almost unsettling. If every nation owes money, then who is the world actually indebted to? Most people imagine a hidden creditor, a shadowy overlord holding all the strings. But follow the trail far enough and you discover something far stranger. The world doesn't owe money to a single entity. It owes money to itself. And that circular logic wasn't a mistake, it was the goal. Across 300 years, 4 financial minds built a system where debt never disappears, interest flows upward indefinitely, and governments are forever locked into borrowing more just to survive. This isn't conspiracy mythology. These events are recorded in official documents, charters, and financial ledgers. Once you understand how the structure was built, you'll realize the global debt isn't a crisis. It's the machine functioning exactly as intended. Let's start with the first architect. Before the late 1600s, kings borrowed money in a straightforward and deeply flawed way. They approached wealthy merchants or nobles, promised repayment with interest, and hoped for the best. If they failed to repay, they simply defaulted. Embarrassing? Yes. But it meant the system reset. Debt didn't linger for generations. It vanished either through repayment or default. Then a Scottish merchant named William Paterson changed the entire economic paradigm. England was in crisis. Locked in an expensive war against France, the government had drained its treasury. Traditional lenders refused to help, remembering England's past defaults. Paterson proposed something unthinkable at the time. He would assemble a group of wealthy merchants to lend the crown £1.2 million, roughly $300 million today. But the twist was revolutionary. The loan would never be paid back. The government would simply pay 8% interest every year forever. To manage this, Paterson suggested creating a new institution, the Bank of England. Merchants would deposit their gold into the bank would lend it to the government, and Parliament would guarantee the annual interest payments through taxes. In return, the merchants received banknotes that represented their gold, notes they could trade like currency. But here's the genius. The principle remained permanent. The debt became eternal. Why did merchants accept this bizarre arrangement? Because the interest was backed by the government's taxing power. As long as England existed, the income stream was guaranteed. And if a merchant wanted liquidity, they could simply sell their banknotes to someone else. The loan was never repaid, but ownership of it could be traded endlessly. Parliament approved Paterson's plan in 1694. The Bank of England was formed. England got its war funding. And the world got its first system of perpetual national debt. But Paterson's real breakthrough came next. The Bank of England was granted the authority to issue paper currency backed by government debt. This meant the government's IOU effectively became money. The more the government borrowed, the more money could be created. It was elegant and dangerous all at once. Great for bankers. Devastating for taxpayers. Within decades, European powers copied the model. France, the Netherlands, and eventually the United States under Alexander Hamilton adopted permanent national debt as a structural feature rather than a temporary burden. And Paterson's creation became the backbone of modern finance. Britain has never fully paid off its national debt, not once in over 3 centuries. It has only rolled it over, refinanced it, and expanded it. The debt trap was officially born. By the 19th century, governments relied heavily on borrowing. But there was no centralized or standardized market. Every loan was negotiated separately, interest rates fluctuated wildly, and only the wealthiest financiers could participate. Then Nathan Rothschild industrialized the entire system. The Rothschilds began as modest money changers in Frankfurt, but by 1800, 5 brothers operated interconnected banking houses across Europe: London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples. This network allowed them to move funds faster than any government courier, and that speed gave them influence no monarch could match. Nathan, leading operations from London, transformed sovereign debt into something new, a tradable global commodity. He bought government bonds at a discount and resold them to investors at a premium, creating a functioning secondary market. Governments received instant funding. Investors gained liquid, tradable assets. Nathan pocketed the spread. His most infamous maneuver came in 1815 during the Battle of Waterloo. Thanks to his unmatched courier network, Nathan learned of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. He acted decisively. First, he quietly sold British bonds, giving the impression Britain was losing. Other investors, panicking, followed his lead. Prices crashed. Then Nathan bought enormous quantities at rock-bottom prices. When news of victory arrived the next day, the market skyrocketed. His profit was astronomical. It wasn't illegal, it was simply the result of information speed. And it changed the nature of sovereign debt forever. After Rothschild, government bonds became so widespread, owned across so many countries and institutions, that defaulting didn't just hurt lenders. It threatened entire financial ecosystems. A British bond might end up in a French pension fund, a German bank, or backing a loan to an Austrian aristocrat. The web became too interconnected to fail. This was the second stage of the debt trap. Debt became too systemically important for any government to default. Nations now had no choice but to keep paying and keep borrowing. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschild family was wealthier than any royal house. And that fortune came almost entirely from one stream: interest on government debt. By 1900, the United States had become an economic powerhouse but still operated with a fractured, outdated financial system. Banks worked independently, the money supply was tied tightly to gold, and there was no central institution capable of stabilizing crises. Then came the panic of 1907. Banks collapsed. Stocks cratered. The economy froze. In the middle of the chaos, one man stepped forward, not a politician, not a government official, but a private banker, J.P. Morgan. Morgan gathered the most powerful financiers in America inside his personal library, locked the doors, and forced them to inject their own money into failing institutions. He orchestrated the bailout himself. The panic ended, and Morgan became the unofficial central banker of the United States. But Morgan was aging. He knew the country needed a permanent, institutionalized mechanism, a true central bank. The problem? Americans hated the idea. They had dismantled two central banks already, viewing them as tools of elite control. So Morgan and his associates came up with a workaround: create a central bank that didn't look like one. They needed a structure privately controlled yet publicly endorsed. Something that seemed like a government institution but was effectively run by the same financiers who shaped the crisis response. The result, revealed in the next chapter of history, would lock the United States into the same system Europe had adopted centuries earlier. The debt trap was now global. By the early 1900s, America was rising as an economic giant, yet its financial system was still a patchwork, fractured, unpredictable, and vulnerable to sudden panics. The crisis of 1907 proved one thing clearly: without a centralized stabilizing force, the entire U.S. economy could collapse from a single shock. J.P. Morgan had stopped that panic personally, using his influence to corral bankers and force them to fund a rescue. But Morgan was gone by 1913, and the system had no replacement for him. So his closest allies quietly built one. On a cold November night in 1910, a private railcar carrying some of the most powerful financiers in America slipped out of New Jersey under strict secrecy. They traveled under fake names, instructed not to speak to anyone, and headed toward a secluded island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. For 9 days, Morgan's associates, Senator Nelson Aldrich, and representatives from the major banking houses designed the framework of what would become the Federal Reserve System. The secrecy wasn't paranoia. It was a necessity. If the public discovered that Wall Street bankers were writing the blueprint for America's monetary future, the backlash would have been explosive. Americans deeply mistrusted central banking. The previous two central banks had been destroyed by populist revolts. So the structure had to be disguised. What they created was political brilliance. It wouldn't be called a central bank. It would be a Federal Reserve System. Not one institution but 12 regional banks. Not openly controlled by Wall Street but overseen by a board appointed by the president. To the public it looked decentralized, democratic, and safe. In reality, the architecture ensured long-term banker control. Each regional Federal Reserve Bank was privately owned by the commercial banks in its district. Those banks elected the boards of their regional feds. And those boards selected members of the National Federal Reserve Board. A circular chain of influence. Government-appointed governors existed, but the heart of the system flowed through private finance. Most importantly, the power to create money and to buy government debt was concentrated in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the district dominated by the biggest Wall Street institutions. The illusion was democratic. The mechanism was oligarchic. In December 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, and most lawmakers barely understood the machinery they had just activated. Before the Federal Reserve existed, government borrowing had natural limits. Banks could only lend what they physically had. The ceiling was real. After the Fed, that ceiling vanished. The new system worked like this. The government issues a bond. The Federal Reserve buys it using newly created money. The government spends that money immediately. The debt sits on the Fed's balance sheet, earning interest forever. Nothing backs the new money except the taxpayer's obligation to service the interest. This innovation created infinite demand for U.S. government debt. And with infinite demand comes infinite borrowing power. The government no longer needed savers or investors. It had a central bank willing to buy debt endlessly. Morgan never saw the full consequences of this mechanism, but his legacy lived through it. Without the Fed, the U.S. could never have accumulated $38 trillion of debt. The free market would have snapped long before. With the Fed, the borrowing pool became bottomless. By the 1970s, the entire developed world was using the same model or variations of it. Governments rolled over old debt, took on new debt, and paid interest perpetually. But developing nations faced a different reality. They borrowed heavily for growth, yet lacked the economic strength to service their loans when conditions changed. Enter the fourth architect. When Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979, inflation was spiraling above 10%, and confidence in the US dollar was evaporating. Foreign governments doubted America's commitment to monetary stability. Volcker responded with a decision that would reshape the global financial map. He raised interest rates to nearly 20%, the highest in American history. It killed inflation. It also detonated a crisis across the developing world. Throughout the 1970s, countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina had borrowed billions in cheap dollars. When U.S. interest rates tripled, their loan payments exploded overnight. Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil $60 billion, Argentina $40 billion, and the interest alone exceeded their export revenues. In August 1982, Mexico announced, "We cannot pay." A global financial collapse was imminent. American banks had lent most of the money, and a Mexican default could have wiped them out. The entire U.S. financial system stood on a cliff's edge. Volcker faced a choice. Let the banks absorb the losses, or keep the debt alive at any cost. He chose survival for the system. Through the International Monetary Fund, Volcker orchestrated a massive rescue operation. But it wasn't a rescue for Mexico. It was a rescue for the banks. The IMF provided loans not to reduce debt, but to ensure developing nations could continue paying interest on their existing debts. These loans came with harsh requirements known as structural adjustments: austerity, privatization, deregulation, currency devaluation, opening domestic markets to foreign capital. Countries were forced to trade economic sovereignty for the ability to keep paying interest. Volcker's innovation was simple and brutal. When a country can't pay, don't forgive. Restructure, extend, bond. Debt became permanent. Governments became dependent. And global finance gained enormous influence. This formula would repeat in crisis after crisis: Argentina in 2001, Greece in 2010, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time the same pattern: debt never dies. It only changes form. When you combine all four architects, the machine becomes clear. Patterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global and impossible to default on. Morgan made it infinite by giving central banks the power to create demand. Volcker made it inescapable by restructuring unpayable debt into forever debt. Today, the world sits on $315 trillion in obligations. Not meant to be repaid, only serviced. year after year. Governments issue debt. Central banks buy it. Taxpayers fund the interest. And asset managers, pension funds, and financial institutions collect the cash flow. Default anywhere threatens collapse everywhere. So no one can default. And that's the hidden truth. Debt isn't a flaw in the system. Debt is the system.